because for much of HMS Belfast's career, this is where the ship's boats were kept, in one place. But it wasn't always so. And if you've been standing right here in 1939, when the ship was new and entered the Royal Navy, you'd be standing on a small airport, because there'd be two quite large aircraft behind me. And in this short talk, I'm going to tell you something about the aircraft, I'm going to tell you about how they were operated, and I'm going to tell you what happened to them. So let's imagine it's 1939, we're just before the outbreak of the Second World War, and there are aircraft on HMS Belfast, and she's not an aircraft carrier. What's going on? Well, it's not unusual. Every navy did the same thing on their big ships, their battleships, their cruisers. So that's the Royal Navy, the Americans, the Germans, the Japanese, the French, the Italians, and so on. And indeed, in the 1930s, there were 3 passenger liners going between Europe and America that could launch aircraft from the deck of the ship. And the reason why they did it was to take letters for passengers. The reason why you did it on a warship was a bit different, and we'll explain that. Now, the Royal Navy used an aircraft called the Supermarine Walrus. And just to explain the name, Supermarine was the name of the company that designed and built the aircraft, and Walrus was the name of the type of aircraft. It also had at least 3 unofficial nicknames. These were the Shagbat, the Flying Pig, and the Steam Pigeon. And I'll explain at least one of those as we go along, but let's have a look at one. So this is a picture of a walrus. Can we all see that okay? And water. You can see the floats here, and the fuselage is shaped like the hull of a boat. But it's also got an undercarriage, a retractable undercarriage, so it's an amphibian. It can land and take off on a runway and an aircraft carrier. And the man who designed it knew an awful lot about seaplanes. His name was Reginald Mitchell, and I'm sure someone's going to shout out the name of the other aircraft he's famous for. Spitfire, absolutely. And if it's a surprise that this and the Spitfire were designed by the same man, well, the Spitfire was developed from very successful racing seaplanes, so it's got a great pedigree. Now, I said that some passenger liners could launch aircraft to carry messages. The reason on the ship was different. Right up to the Second World War and into the early part of the Second World War, there was no radar on ships. It's being developed, it's been invented, but right up until then, if you're out at sea in a warship, if you want to see the enemy, you want to see if your shells are hitting the target, basically you give a man a pair of binoculars and you put him as high as you can up a mast, and he can see to the horizon. But with an aircraft, you can go a lot higher, you can go further. So they're used for reconnaissance. You can also attack with a walrus, and it can carry bombs and depth charges. And depth charges are just bombs designed to go off underwater to attack a submarine. The aircraft that were on HMS Belfast never attacked a submarine. They never needed to, they never had the chance to. But they did, one day, attack fish. Let me explain. So in 1943, HMS Belfast was off the coast of Iceland. She was involved in Arctic convoy duties, and the aircraft were on a practice exercise, and they dropped, well, one of them dropped the depth charges and hit a shoal of cod, intentionally. The depth charges went off, killed a lot of the fish which floated to the surface, so then they brought the aircraft down, landed if you like on the water, and gathered up the fish. But they couldn't take off again. There were 2 reasons for that. One is they'd exceeded the weight limit, and secondly, the fish were sliding about. So they actually taxied back, drove back on the surface a few miles to get back to the ship. And then it was fish and chips for everyone. Now, if that sounds a bit unlikely, as though I've made it up, here's a photograph.
Wow.
Now, this photo was taken by a man called Petty Officer John Hearn. He was on board, and very unusually, he was allowed to have a camera. So he took this and a couple of other pictures. You can see how big the cod are, but look at the man. He's one of the crew of the aircraft, and he and the aircraft are part of the Fleet Air Arm. And that was and still is the Royal Navy's own air force. They operated the aircraft, and the flight crews were part of that. You can see he's dressed for operations, he's got his flight suit on, he's got his life jacket on. Compare that with this picture, which shows you more of the aircrew of HMS Belfast. And as you can see, they look a lot smarter, they look more enthusiastic, and also they're on land. And that's because this picture was taken in 1939 when they were about to go off and join the brand new ship. And also behind them we can see the aircraft itself. So I'll now talk about how they were operated. Now the reason why I'm going to do the talk up here is because I can point to things. And obviously a lot has changed in the 85 years or so since Belfast was launched, but we can still see a lot. Now to help you, look at this picture. This is a photograph of a model of where we are now. It's a model of Belfast flight deck. It was made, we think, during the war. It's a bit homemade, but you can see the key features. So this thing here is that funnel. You can see we've got a crane. That's one of the originals, but when she was built there were two, and they were either side of the funnel. So if you look just behind you, so in the red t-shirt, you see that circular plate on the deck. That's covering the original position of one of the cranes. And these things here, which look a little bit like Stonehenge, they are in fact representing the ends of that superstructure, which you can see looks like two boxes. And the reason why they're two boxes is because they were hangars. So each of those boxes was an aircraft hangar, and each hangar housed one of the planes. And to get them in, the wings folded back. You can see this one here, it's outside the hangar, and the wings are folded back, and inside there, that's one of the, that's the other plane, right the way inside the hangar. So if you go in the cafe, you're going inside an aircraft hangar. The ceiling looks a bit low, that's because an extra floor was added after the war. Okay, and also see this thing here, try and remember that, that is the launch trolley, and I'm going to mention that again in a moment, but that's a photograph of it. Now this next picture is of a very unusual aircraft called the New Routemaster Bus, and I'm showing you this, and there's one going over. I'm showing you this for size comparison. If you park the aircraft next to this bus, excuse me, the aircraft is slightly higher than the bus and slightly longer, and the wingspan is equivalent to the length of 1.2 of these buses, so it's quite a big aircraft. And if we look at this picture, this is taken inside the hangar, so over there looking out, so there's the funnel again, and you can see that the wings are being opened out, and the aircraft has been pulled out of the hangar on a special trolley system, and these metal strips on the deck coming towards us, they are the foundations of the original trolley rails still in place, so that would have gone into the hangar. Now I should just explain, this picture wasn't taken on HMS Belfast, there isn't an equivalent picture on Belfast, but this was taken on HMS Edinburgh, and Edinburgh and Belfast were exactly the same design, so the view would have been exactly the same. Okay, let's talk now about how you get the aircraft into the air. I've said that it could take off on a runway with its engine, but most runways are a lot longer than the 66 feet width of this deck, so it needs a helping hand, and that comes in the form of a 33-ton catapult and the use of some explosives. Let me explain. This is a side view of the catapult. Okay, we'll see that. Okay, you wait there. The catapult was right here, going from side to side, but it wasn't sitting on top. This is a steel structure, and it was built on the deck below. So all you see at this level are the rails that trolley runs on that we saw in the photo. Now, to launch the aircraft, these extensions are pulled out. They normally sit within inside the framework, but they're pulled out, and that gives you a total length of about 92 feet. And the aircraft is sitting on that launch trolley, ready to go. Now, launching the aircraft is a bit like firing the gun. In the gun, you've got a firing chamber at the end. You put the shell in, you put explosive in using cordite, you light the explosive, and that shoots the shell out. It's the same principle here. There's a firing chamber at one end, you put cordite in, the same explosive, and when that's ignited, it doesn't fire a shell, it fires a piston. And and that piston shoots across from one side to the other very quickly. And the really clever bit is that that piston is connected to that trolley by steel cables. This deck is about 66 feet wide. There's 846 feet of steel cable in that mechanism. It's in a pulley system, it's going backwards and forwards, and the pulleys multiply the speed. So as the trolley shoots, as the piston shoots across, so the trolley shoots across as well, but 4 times faster. And that means that the trolley and the aircraft go from 0 to 65 miles an hour in about 60 feet and about 3 seconds. And when the trolley gets about halfway across, it starts to slow down and collapse. And that's because by then, the aircraft is going fast enough to fly. It's been given a massive push start, and then it flies off. And in this next picture, which was taken on HMS Mauritius, you can see the aircraft has left the trolley and it's now flying. All see that okay? Now, whenever you launched an aircraft, a lot of people who were not on duty would come to watch. There were 3 reasons for that. It didn't happen very often, it was quite spectacular, and something might go wrong. And if something goes wrong, you want to be there. To help, of course. But the men who are sitting in this boat are not spectators. They're part of the procedure, they're a crash crew. So if, say, the engine failed and the plane went down, that boat would be dropped and they would be able to try and rescue the crew. But believe it or not, it was extremely rare for anything to go wrong on takeoff. This was a tried and tested system, it worked, and it was very efficient. But the next bit, getting the aircraft back, was a bit more risky. We'll move on to that now. So when the aircraft has completed its mission, it's going to come back. It's a seaplane, it's going to come down in the water. And to help with that, the ship turns at 20 degrees. And it does that because it creates inside the turn an area of flatter water. It's called a slick. It's not an oil slick, they're not pouring oil on the water, it's just a natural effect. And the pilot will aim for that. No matter how good he is, no matter how careful he is, it's a big plane, it's going to make a big splash. And when it hits the water, it throws up a lot of spray, just like that. And that spray goes up and hits the hot engine. And remember that nickname, the steam pigeon? That's where that one comes from, because a great cloud of steam would often come off the engine. The ship's still moving, so the plane is then going to come alongside, the pilot will bring it alongside to be picked up by the crane. Now, there's the crane over there. Remember, it's actually over there when this was happening. It's got a reach of 55 feet, the crane's been pulled out. What they're going to do is they're going to pick it up with the crane, lift it up and bring it back on board. But if you look at that hook, that's far too big, far too heavy, far too clumsy to hook straight onto the plane. So hanging from it was a special device which worked a little bit like this. You see, I can pull it down. It's a bit like a telescopic dog lead in a way. The point is you could easily pull it down, you could hook it on, then you can lock it, and then the crane can lift the aircraft up and bring it back in. If that sounds nice and straightforward, who wants this man's job?
Oh.
All see him? That's the radio operator from the plane. He's had to get out, he's had to climb up and sit on the front of the top wing. So he's sitting at the height of a double-decker bus, he's bobbing up and down in the water, there's an 11,000 ton warship looming over him, and best of all, the engine's still on, so the propeller's spinning around. So the last thing he wants to do is fall backwards. There is a strap on the top wing which will tie around his leg to stop that, but even so it's not a good place to be, and he'll stay sitting up there while the aircraft is lifted up and brought back in. A man called Michael Tibbs was an officer on another cruiser, and he wrote home saying, "We nearly always had an accident, and this time I have a photograph as the plane bashed into the side of the ship and broke the end of the wing." And that was very common. And if we look again at that picture inside the hangar, did you notice these things?
Yeah, spare wings.
Spare wings. And that's why. So they could repair the aircraft if that happened. They had the material, they had the technicians, but it put the aircraft out for quite a bit of time, so that was a big problem. So that was how the aircraft were operated. Let's wind up by explaining what happened to them. So in 1942, the Admiralty, in charge of all the Navy ships, did a study to look at whether it was still a good idea to have aircraft on cruisers and battleships. and they decided it wasn't. And therefore the aircraft were withdrawn, and Belfast was one of the last ships to lose her aircraft, and they were taken off in June of 1943, exactly 1 year before D-Day. And there's three main reasons why that happened, and the biggest of those reasons is sitting up there. It's radar. By 1943, radar had been fitted into ships. Belfast had the most modern radar going, and it could do the job of the aircraft. It could do it without the fuss, without the hassle, and it could do it in bad weather. So the aircraft were out of a job, but they weren't, because even though these planes were designed to be launched by catapults off ships, they were already being used for air-sea rescue. So they were redeployed. So just imagine that a Spitfire pilot based in Britain has been on a mission attacking, say, an airfield in occupied France. He's coming back to Britain and his aircraft has been damaged. He knows he won't make it back home. He knows he's going to have to come down in the sea. So he radios his position, he ditches in the channel, he gets in his dinghy, and with a bit of luck he's rescued, and with a bit of luck by a walrus. Now just think about that. He's crashed in one plane, the Spitfire, and been rescued by another one, the Walrus, and they were both designed by the same man. And you can't say that very often. So that's the story of the aircraft. They weren't actually here for all that long in Belfast history, but they were here to do a specific job, and they did that job quite well within the limits of the technology. But when a better way of doing it came along, they went off and got another job.